Frank Delaney. I had been waiting for over an hour in the gate 27 of the Denver International Airport, still when there were more than 40 minutes left until the boarding. At 78 years old, the punctuality was not only a habit, it was a sign of respect. He wore a jacket beige, simple but clean, and in his right hand held with force he plane ticket with the number 14C underlined in red. That one seat meant more than comfort. It had chosen and paid with anticipation because its knee, damaged by a combat wound in Vietnam, did not allow bending over long journeys. His destination was Annapolis, where his granddaughter would graduate from the Naval Academy, becoming the first woman of the family in wearing a uniform. Although his body he was tired, his eyes shone with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The approach was calm until, already inside the plane, and with he fastened his seatbelt, a flight attendant stopped next to him. "Sir, we have a family that needs to be together. Could you change seats?" he said, with a polite but inflexible tone. Frank explained his situation. He even showed a medical letter he had with him, but there was no negotiation. They offered him the 32B in the back, between two strangers, without space to stretch the leg. He looked at his around looking for support, but only found faces avoidant and eyebrows wrinkled. The pressure, it was subtle but overwhelming. I didn't want to be the cause of a delay or call the attention. He breathed deep, stood up with difficulty, and before leaving, he introduced himself loudly. "Sergeant Frank Delaney, Marine Corps, retired. I yield my seat under protest." Then path with dignity toward a background of the plane. Seat 32B was everything Frank feared, cramped, no view, and with so little space that its leg wound began to beat in how much he settled. To his left, a man I was sleeping with the arms crossed. To the right, a young woman with headphones or not even noticed his presence. Nobody said nothing. Nobody you offered help. What hurt the most was not the physical discomfort, but the indifference. Frank had served 32 years, decorated twice, and that tomorrow, in that aisle narrow of a commercial airplane, it didn't seem to matter. It closed the eyes and concentrated in the breathing, repeating to himself that the only thing that mattered was seeing his granddaughter on the other side of the country. I didn't need applause, I just wanted to arrive. If this part touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. That way we can continue telling stories worth hearing. But not all of them it ignored him. Charlotte Hayes, sitting a few rows ahead, had observed everything from the home. I wasn't an influencer, or I was looking for likes. I was a citizen with principles. He saw the Frank's face when handed over his seat. He saw his limp. He saw the way he presented himself with a firm and unbitter voice. Moved by a mixture of indignation and respect, she took his phone and wrote a message to her friend Allison, operations manager at the airline. Not included, no loud claims or threats legal. He only reported with measured words what he had witnessed, a veteran displaced for convenience. To the "a few minutes, your message there" was arrived at the cockpit, and there, between navigation maps and flashing lights, the Captain David Miller frowned. He frowned when reading his name, Frank Delaney, new. David Miller was no ordinary pilot. Before flying the Heavens commercials, had served as a lieutenant colonel in his same Marine Corps. I remembered that name with clarity. Delaney, a living legend among veterans, known for his tempering under fire and its decision during a bloody retreat in Vietnam. David left the controls in the hands of the co-pilot. He stood up from his seat and crossed the aisle with decisive step. The silence in the cabin was palpable when the passengers they saw walked toward a background of the plane. It did not carry hurry, but his gaze spoke of urgency and respect. When he reached row 32, stopped in front of Frank and stood at attention, in salute position. "Sergeant Frank Delaney, sir. It is an honor to have you aboard." His voice was firm, clear. The murmur of the passengers stopped. Everyone was looking. Frank, surprised, could hardly return the greeting. Then David continued, On behalf of this crew and all of us who serve, I ask apologies. This seat is not worthy of you. and turning to the stewardess, ordered that he will assign his seat 1A in first class. Immediately. If no one it yielded, would use he yours. Nobody argued. No one dared. Frank tried resist at first, muttering that it was not necessary, that it was already good there. But the look of the captain did not allow objections. The same firmness that he used in the war, there had now in a commercial airplane, a flight. Attendant, you offered he arm to help him up, and although Frank was not one to accept favors, this time he did. When began to walk along the hallway, the atmosphere had changed. Passengers who had previously, they had ignored him. Now they were moving away to leave him pass. Some even carried hand to chest in sign of respect. Each row he crossed was a silent recognition, a gesture that was not needed words. Are you excited to see acts? So, support this channel with your subscription. It's the only way we can keep creating content with soul. Upon reaching first class, the seat 1A I expected with a folded blanket and a drink served. But before he could sit, a young man stood up from row 1C with the eyes full of tears. It was a man in his 30s years old, thin with a visible scar in a neck. Sergeant Delaney. You don't remember me, do you? I am Corporal Ellis. Afghanistan, 2005. He pulled me out of a convoy in flames. You saved me. Life. The voice broke, and what followed was an awkward but grateful hug. Frank blinked sometimes, as if the past you would have fallen on top of him without warning. He didn't say a lot, just squeezed the arm of the young with force. The plane whole was in silence. Nobody looked your cell phone, nobody was speaking. The scene had something sacred, something that cannot be seen in a commercial flight, and that no one safety announcement could interrupt. Captain David returned to the cabin, but before closing the door, took the intercom. His voice was heard clearly on all speakers. Passengers, today we witnessed something important. A poorly applied policy almost made us forget the value of memory and respect. But we will not leave the hour backs. Not it we did in combat, not we will do it at 30,000 feet high. The applause that followed was not immediate, nor thunderous. It was slow, restrained, as if each hand clap was searching for the right rhythm so as not to break the solemnity of the moment. It was not an organized tribute. It was something deeper, an act spontaneous gratitude. Frank, already seated, closed the eyes for a moment. I felt a knot in the throat that did not come of the physical pain. For a moment I was not in a plane, but back with his men, in some dusty camp where the respect was a sacred currency. I didn't know as that day had turned badly for then straightened so precisely, but I was grateful in silence. Charlotte. Hayes, who had sent the initial message, I observed everything with the eyes brilliant. He wasn't looking for the limelight, but he knew there was made it correct. He took out his notebook, a custom old, from when he was a journalist, and wrote a few lines to remember. Today, an entire country seemed to recover something that was losing, the ability to see the other. He thought in his own father, also a veteran, deceased years before without recognition any. What I had just witnessed was, in a certain way, an act of reparation, not just for Frank, but for all those who were ever silently forgotten. The rest of the flight, it passed quietly, with a different atmosphere, as if the passengers shared something invisible. Frank slept a little for the first time in weeks without nightmares. When woke up, found a folded note in the tray. Thank you for your service. My son wants to be like you. 13D. There was no signature, but there was a clumsy drawing of a child in uniform. Frank the saved in the pocket of the jacket, where it remained for years after. In that flight, no passenger he complained again of coffee, of space, nor of the delay. Everyone knew that this journey was no longer common. There was become part of something bigger. When they landed in Annapolis, the captain, he left the cabin again, this time to personally escort Frank to the exit. The passengers stayed in their seats until he descended, something almost never seen before. Outside in the reception area, a young woman in a white uniform held a handmade sign with blue markers. "Welcome, Grandpa." It was his granddaughter, the reason for the whole trip. When it saw it appear, he ran toward her without thinking about his leg wound, neither in military protocol. Hugged so hard that Frank had to suppress a wince, but he said nothing. He hugged her back, with the eyes filled with water. Walking toward the car, the granddaughter noticed that something in his grandfather had changed. It wasn't just tiredness, it was something else. "Are you all right, Grandpa?" he asked. Frank nodded, and for a moment he thought not to tell him anything. But then, in a softer voice than usual, he summarized what there was past. He didn't exaggerate, he didn't dramatize, he just told the facts. She heard in silence, with the fixed gaze in the horizon. Upon arriving at the hotel, he took his cell phone and searched in the networks. Already, there was a video circulating, the moment of the greeting of the captain, recorded by someone in tourist class. It was going viral. The video had thousands of views in a matter of hours. There was no editing, no background music, no effects. Only the sound of the captain saluting and Frank's voice introducing himself as a retired sergeant. The comments were a cascade of gratitude and shame collective. "Thank you, Sir Delaney. Sorry for not looking. My grandfather also was invisible." Some media. Locals began to replicate the history, and in less than a day, the image of Frank walking through the aisle of the airplane became a symbol of something that people didn't know they needed to remember. "Granddaughter, you showed the messages in the cell phone." He the read silently, without knowing very well good that do with that sudden attention. Days after, in the graduation ceremony, Frank was invited by the Admiral to stand during the speech. "We have among us a true war hero, not because of the medals, but by the example," he said the Admiral. "Frank stood up with help of your cane, without waiting any longer." The applause was long and sustained. Some cadets were crying. Granddaughter, standing firm next to her companions, did not blink. That tomorrow, he was not just the grandfather of a newly graduated officer, he was the living memory of something that's still worth defending. After the act, many came to greet him. Some even, they asked for photos. Frank accepted everything with humility, although still it was hard to understand why that wave of recognition there was arrived now. A week later, he arrived a large envelope with the logo of the airline. Inside, a letter signed by the president of the company. It declared guest of honor for life. He could fly in any national or international route, always in first class, without cost sum, for what he has given, for what he represents, and for what he taught us without a single complaint, he said the text. Together with the letter came with a metal card with his name engraving and a small golden pin with the insignia of the company. Frank smiled with disbelief that showed his granddaughter, who it hugged without say a word. It was as if the country will try to make up for, at least a little, the accumulated neglect of decades. But the elderly surprise arrived days after, in other envelope, this time with a seal of the Department of Defense. Inside, a letter informed that his military file had been reopened. After a review of forgotten archives and testimonies, they officially confirmed a feat that had never been properly documented. Recognized, during an ambush in Vietnam, Frank had saved 6 Marines under fire enemy, dragging them one by one with the leg destroyed. A decoration was attached retroactive, signed by the Secretary of Defense, and a handwritten note by an anonymous official who said, "You were never invisible to us. We just took too long, say it." Frank read the letter twice before putting it away in a wooden box where he kept old photographs, badges, and letters from his years in service. That night, he lit the small lamp of his desk and stared at a photo on black and white of his platoon. Many of them did not return. Others, like him, returned with parts that no one eye could see, broken pieces. For the first time in a long time, he felt something inside him settle, like a vertebra out of place that finally found his sight. It was not just the medal, it was the fact that someone in somewhere, had been taken time to look back. The story crossed borders. It was read in school assemblies. It was shared in veterans' centers, appeared in newscasts, and was the subject of debates on opinion programs. Some that they called the flight that changed a policy. Others simply they spoke of the man of the seat, 14C. The airline, under pressure from the repercussion, changed its protocols. From that month, any seat reassignment for family grouping reasons was to exclude passengers with certified medical conditions or with military history. On each aircraft of the fleet, a discreet sign next to the main entrance reminded, "Not all heroes, they wear visible uniforms. Some they carry cane. If you think these stories are needed in the world, subscribe, it's free." But for us, it means being able to continue. In his neighborhood, Frank began to receive unexpected visitors, neighbors who had barely noticed him before they greeted each other and approached with cookies, letters, or just to listen to him tell stories. An 8-year-old girl, years you asked, interview him for a school project on courage. He accepted, somewhat awkwardly at first, but ended up enjoying every naive question. Would it be fear? Did he cry? Ever? "Do you like the planes?" Frank responded with patience, surprised at how much I needed to tell those things. For years had kept silent, as if what had happened in war was something that did not deserve to be shared. Now I understood that memory was not a burden, but a way to let go. Fingerprint. Subscribe to the channel if you think there are memories that shouldn't get lost. You help us continue giving them a voice. Charlotte Hayes, meanwhile, followed with his life, but not without receive also his attention share. Your message. He was considered by many to be the catalyst for everything happened. She was invited to speak in a symposium on ethics in the customer service and wrote a short article entitled "Compassion Also Flies." In a radio interview, they asked why it there was done. Your answer was simple: because no one else does it was doing. And because my dad taught me that not looking is also a choice. That phrase went viral, printed on t-shirts, stickers and posters in schools and universities. Frank's granddaughter, now an active officer in the Navy, became an important voice within youth military circles. In his speeches, he always mentioned his grandfather, not only as a soldier, but as an example of dignity. He taught me that one can stand firm without raising your voice, that giving in is not giving up, and that sometimes honor travels in tourist class without anyone I noticed it. His words, recorded in a promotion ceremony, they became part of the institutional archive of the Naval Academy, as a reminder that character is not measured by rank, but by actions small and consistent. With as the months passed, Frank began to receive invitations to attend commemorative events, deliver diplomas, and even give small gifts talks. Although it was never felt completely comfortable with the attention, accepted for one reason: if your history could have a single veteran treated with respect, then worth the penalty. At one of those events, a young man is approached and showed a photo in his cell phone. It was his father, one of the 6 Marines Frank had rescued in Vietnam. "Thanks to you, I exist," he said. Frank didn't know what to answer, just took his shoulder with the same hand with the one that was there supported so many companions wounded. With the time, some details of the flight were left in the background, but the symbol remained. In several airports of the country began to install small plates in the boarding lounges with the inscription "Seat 14C." in honor of those who served and were forgotten. Each plaque had a QR code that led to a short video with the Frank's story. It wasn't a marketing campaign, it was institutional memory, and most importantly, it inspired others. Veterans who would never had shared their stories began to talk. Families whole rediscovered roots that they thought were buried, all for an act of silent dignity, followed by a just reaction. Frank never saw Captain David Miller in person again, but they maintained correspondence by mail. From time to time when they exchanged service anecdotes or newspaper clippings were sent. In one of his letters, David wrote, "That day in He Plain was the first time in many years I felt like I was flying something more than a trade route. Thanks for reminding me who I am." Frank hung up. That letter in his office, right next to a flag folded and a framed photo of your granddaughter in uniform. Sometimes, when entering the room, stayed in silence for a few seconds just to look. In a television interview he accepted with true suspicion, Frank summed it all up with a phrase that moved the country. "It wasn't about me, it was about reminding us that seeing the other, listening to the other, matters, even in a plane, even when have hurry." The presenter did not know that say for a few seconds. That phrase was repeated in articles, in political speeches, in classrooms, and even in public service announcements. I didn't have intention of becoming a symbol, but it was. Because in a time of noise and disconnection, Frank represented something that many they had forgotten, the quiet strength of the I respect. That flight, which had started with a silent injustice, it became in a lesson collective. There was no great production behind it, no celebrities involved, just ordinary people who made it correct, from Charlotte and her message to David and his firm gesture, and each passenger who learned to look differently. It was a chain of small decisions with profound impact. And although Frank returned to the routine of his quiet life, his history continued flying. Every time a plane took off with a veteran on board being treated with dignity, that history was repeating itself. It was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone. As the years passed by, Frank became a respected figure, not only among veterans, but also among the young people. I received letters from students, cadets, even from children who had heard his history in the school. Some they asked tips, others simply they wanted to thank him. He answered them all by hand, with firm handwriting, sometimes clumsy because of the arthritis. Each answered letter was, for him, a way to continue serving, not in war, but in peace. Not with weapons, but with memory. Granddaughter, you helped organize the answers, sitting next to him with a constant smile, as if each written word reinforced he bridged between generations. One day, he received an unexpected invitation. The Congress wanted to surrender to him tribute with a medal commemorative for his service and for the social impact of its history. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't looking for honors, much less speeches. But his granddaughter, you said something that made him change his mind. "You're not going for yourself. You're going for all those who didn't have this opportunity." That's how Frank, with his cane and his jacket beige, walked through the hallways from the Capitol escorted by officers. Young people who they looked as if they were walking with a legend. And perhaps, for the first time, he also began to believe it a bit. During the ceremony in Congress, when they delivered the medal, Frank did not give a long speech. He just thanked me and then asked permission to say a few more words. With the slow but firm voice, looked at those present and said, "Memory is fragile. Let us not allow silence to erase those who they gave everything for this country. I don't ask tributes. I ask that we look, that we listen, that we not let pass by the one who walks slowly because of a wound invisible." The room was left in silence. Then, as in He Plain that day, the applause was soft, long, with I respect true. On leaving of the Capitol, Frank stopped for a few seconds in the stairs. He looked towards down, where a crowd of people expected. Some they cheered, others just they observed in silence. His granddaughter was there, with the eyes bright. And it helped down each step calmly. In half of the crowd, a teenager approached with a history book open. "Are you the of the plane?" he asked. With astonishment, Frank smiled and nodded. "The boy, he spread out a page with your photo, taken on day of the flight. Sign it for me." Frank signed, and as he did, he felt that this moment was not just his. It was a shared act of country, of reparation, of conscience. With he passed. Of the time, Frank began to go out less. The age weighed, and although his mind was still sharp, his body you demanded longer breaks. But every time he sat down in his favorite armchair by the window and saw pass a plane in his sky, he smiled. Not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude. He knew that somewhere another veteran was being seen, heard, respected. His history there was open doors, not for him, but for those who would come afterwards. And that, he thought, was worth more than any medal. In one of his last interviews, they asked if he would change anything about what he experienced. Frank stayed. He was silent for a few seconds and replied, "Maybe there would be spoken before. Not for me. For those who can no longer do it." That sentence closed, he reported, and it was reproduced in newspapers and magazines across the country. He was no longer just a decorated veteran. He was an active witness to the importance of remembering, not to give in to the comfort from oblivion. And while the world kept turning, its history continued being told, word of mouth, as a modern legend with roots real and deep. Frank's granddaughter used to say that his grandpa not only left a legacy, but a mission. After his retirement, he began working with veteran support organizations, promoting not only benefits and mental health, but also visibility. In each talk, he showed the image of the seat 14C and had the story of that flight. Everything changed because someone decided not to look towards other side, he repeated. With the time, others' families adopted the gesture. They reserved his seat 14C in some flights and left a thank you note to the veteran who sat there. Thus, the gesture became tradition. Frank passed away on a quiet autumn morning, while I was sleeping in his house, with a flag folded in his nightstand and the photo of her granddaughter graduating in the wall. There were no loud headlines, but there were a discreet tribute. At each military base, in each school that had told its history, and on every flight where a passenger stood up to give up his seat with dignity. The airline renamed a plane in his honor, Spirit of Frank Delaney, with a golden plaque just above the seat 14C. Memory, everyone understood, doesn't need noise to be eternal. It only needs to be remembered with justice. Years later, a documentary was collected his history. It was titled The Man of 14C and was broadcast on schools, universities, and film festivals. It wasn't just about Frank, but about all those who, like him, had been ignored out of habit and recognized only when someone decided to speak. Charlotte, now retired, participated in the narration. Captain David Miller also it did. His granddaughter, now commander, closed the documentary with these words: "Justice is not always comes with uniforms or with speeches. Sometimes comes with a gesture, and that gesture can change everything. Because in the end, what began as an injustice silently transformed in a chain of simple yet profound human acts." Frank Delaney did not seek to be remembered, but he was impossible to forget it. Not because of the medals, not for the headlines, but for what it inspired, a new way of seeing. Because sometimes all it takes is a seat, a look, a decision. And in that flight from Denver to Annapolis, not only were destinies crossed, a truth was restored. A truth that now flies in every story told, in every veteran heard, and in every heart that decides simply not to look away other side. If you made it this far, make this effort worthwhile. Subscribe, comment, or share. Your support keeps this channel alive.